Welcome back to Background Historian. Tonight we will explore Isaac Newton, his accomplishments, and the effect his work had on civilization as we know it. Sit back, relax, and let yourself begin to doze off. Let's begin our journey in the quiet countryside of 17th century England. It is Christmas Day, 1642, though by our modern calendar, that would be January 4th, 1643. On this winter morning in Woolsthorpe by Colsterworth, a tiny village in Lincolnshire, a small and frail baby is born. So small, in fact, that some feared he wouldn't survive. But he did. His name was Isaac Newton. Newton entered the world prematurely, in a farmhouse surrounded by snow-covered fields. His father, also named Isaac, had died just months before. His mother, Hannah Ascuff Newton, was left widowed with a newborn and a modest estate. Young Isaac would never meet his father, and perhaps this early absence planted seeds of solitude and introspection in the boy's soul. As Isaac grew, it became clear that he was no ordinary child. He was curious, deeply imaginative, and solitary. When he wasn't helping on the family farm, he could often be found constructing small mechanical devices, sundials, water clocks, even miniature windmills. He preferred the company of tools and books to that of other children. But his life took a difficult turn when his mother remarried. She left young Isaac with his grandparents and moved to live with her new husband, taking with her the warmth and stability Isaac had known. This separation would mark him deeply. For years, he felt abandoned, an emotion that may have contributed to the relentless drive and guarded temperament he carried throughout life. He was sent to the King's School in Grantham, where he lived in the home of an apothecary. There, he began to truly engage with books. Latin, Greek, and classical philosophy. But most of all, mathematics and natural philosophy. He scribbled notes in the margins of his textbooks and filled pages with diagrams and experiments of his own invention. He wasn't the top student at first. In fact, he often seemed disinterested, until one day, after being bullied by a classmate, he resolved to rise to the top. And he did. Quickly. By age 18, Isaac had completed his studies in Grantham. He returned home briefly before heading to Cambridge University, specifically Trinity College, in 1661. The world he entered there was in transition. The Renaissance had ignited a new thirst for knowledge, and the works of thinkers like Galileo and Kepler were circulating widely, even if sometimes secretly. Newton studied the ancient philosophers but found their explanations lacking. He read Descartes, Gassendi, and Boyle. But above all, he found inspiration in the methods of Francis Bacon and the mathematics of Euclid. The idea that nature could be explained with precise mathematical laws. That was a concept that captured his mind like a flame to kindling. But it was in 1665, during the outbreak of the Great Plague, that Newton's mind truly began to blossom. The university was closed. He returned home to Woolsthorpe for what might have seemed like an academic pause. Instead, it became a period of astonishing productivity, what many later called his annus mirabilis, his year of miracles. During this time, in the quiet of the countryside, he made groundbreaking discoveries in mathematics, optics, and what would become classical physics. He laid the foundations for calculus, developing a method he would later call fluxions, a tool for understanding rates of change and motion. Though Leibniz would also develop calculus independently, sparking a bitter dispute in years to come, Newton's contributions were foundational. In the same year, Newton began to explore the nature of light. Using a simple prism, he he discovered that white light was not pure but a combination of colors. A spectrum. This was a revelation. It contradicted centuries of thought dating back to Aristotle. And it would become central to his later work in optics. And then there was gravity. Legend has it that Newton saw an apple fall from a tree and began to ponder why it fell straight down. Whether or not the story is literally true, what matters is the idea it inspired, that the same force which pulls an apple to the ground might also govern the movement of the moon around Earth and the planets around the sun. This was revolutionary. The idea that the same laws applied to both the heavens and the earth. That was heretical to many. For centuries, people had believed that the celestial realm was different, divine, untouchable. But Newton was about to unify the cosmos. These formative discoveries were not published right away. Newton, ever cautious, kept many of his findings to himself for years. He feared criticism and controversy. But his work did not go unnoticed. After returning to Cambridge, Newton was elected a Fellow of Trinity College, and later became the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, a position once held by Stephen Hawking centuries later. And in 1687, under the encouragement of astronomer Edmund Halley, he finally published what would become one of the most important scientific works in human history. The Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or simply, the Principia. It was here that Newton laid out his three laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation. These ideas would not only explain how objects move on Earth but how the entire solar system operates. Let us pause here. We are only beginning to understand the depth of what Newton uncovered. His work, born in solitude and silence, would echo across centuries. And his mind, brilliant, meticulous, and at times tormented, was only beginning to shape the future of science. Let's begin our journey in the quiet countryside of 17th century England. It is Christmas Day, 1642, though by our modern calendar, that would be January 4th, 1643. On this winter morning in Woolsthorpe by Colsterworth, a tiny village in Lincolnshire, a small and frail baby is born. So small, in fact, that some feared he wouldn't survive. But he did. His name was Isaac Newton. Newton entered the world prematurely, in a farmhouse surrounded by snow-covered fields. His father, also named Isaac, had died just months before. His mother, Hannah Ascalf Newton, was left widowed with a newborn and a modest estate. Young Isaac would never meet his father, and perhaps this early absence planted seeds of solitude and introspection in the boy's soul. As Isaac grew, it became clear that he was no ordinary child. He was curious, deeply imaginative, and solitary. When he wasn't helping on the family farm, he could often be found constructing small mechanical devices. Sundials, water clocks, even miniature windmills. He preferred the company of tools and books to that of other children. But his life took a difficult turn when his mother remarried. She left young Isaac with his grandparents and moved to live with her new husband, taking with her the warmth and stability Isaac had known. This separation would mark him deeply. For years, he felt abandoned, an emotion that may have contributed to the relentless drive and guarded temperament he carried throughout life. He was sent to the King's School in Grantham, where he lived in the home of an apothecary. There, he began to truly engage with books. Latin, Greek, and classical philosophy. But most of all, mathematics and natural philosophy. He scribbled notes in the margins of his textbooks and filled pages with diagrams and experiments of his own invention. He wasn't the top student at first. In fact, he often seemed disinterested. Until one day, after being bullied by a classmate, he resolved to rise to the top. And he did. Quickly. By age 18, Isaac had completed his studies in Grantham. He returned home briefly before heading to Cambridge University, specifically Trinity College, in 1661. The world he entered there was in transition. The Renaissance had ignited a new thirst for knowledge, and the works of thinkers like Galileo and Kepler were circulating widely, even if sometimes secretly. Newton studied the ancient philosophers but found their explanations lacking. He read Descartes, Gassendi, and Boyle. But above all, he found inspiration in the methods of Francis Bacon and the mathematics of Euclid. The idea that nature could be explained with precise mathematical laws, that was a concept that captured his mind like a flame to kindling. But it was in 1665, during the outbreak of the Great Plague, that Newton's mind truly began to blossom. The university was closed. He returned home to Woolsthorpe for what might have seemed like an academic pause. Instead, it became a period of astonishing productivity, what many later called his annus mirabilis, his year of miracles. During this time, in the quiet of the countryside, he made groundbreaking discoveries in mathematics, optics, and what would become classical physics. He laid the foundations for calculus, developing a method he would later call fluxions, a tool for understanding rates of change and motion. Though Leibniz would also develop calculus independently, sparking a bitter dispute in years to come, Newton's contributions were foundational. In the same year, Newton began to explore the nature of light. Using a simple prism, he discovered that white light was not pure, but a combination of colors, a spectrum. This was a revelation. It contradicted centuries of thought dating back to Aristotle. And it would become central to his later work in optics. And then there was gravity. Legend has it that Newton saw an apple fall from a tree and began to ponder why it fell straight down. Whether or not the story is literally true, what matters is the idea it inspired, that the same force which pulls an apple to the ground might also govern the movement of the moon around Earth, and the planets around the sun. This was revolutionary. The idea that the same laws applied to both the heavens and the earth. That was heretical to many. For centuries, people had believed that the celestial realm was different, divine, untouchable. But Newton was about to unify the cosmos. These formative discoveries were not published right away. Newton, ever cautious, kept many of his findings to himself for years. He feared criticism and controversy. But his work did not go unnoticed. After returning to Cambridge, Newton was elected a Fellow of Trinity College, and later became the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, a position once held by Stephen Hawking centuries later. And in 1687, under the encouragement of astronomer Edmund Halley, he finally published what would become one of the most important scientific works in human history. The Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or simply, the Principia. It was here that Newton laid out his three laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation. These ideas would not only explain how objects move on Earth but how the entire solar system operates. Let us pause here. We are only beginning to understand the depth of what Newton uncovered. His work, born in solitude and silence, would echo across centuries. And his mind, brilliant, meticulous, and at times tormented, was only beginning to shape the future of science. One of Newton's earliest clashes came with Robert Hooke, an accomplished scientist and member of the Royal Society. Hooke had also studied gravity and claimed that Newton had borrowed some of his ideas. While Hooke had suggested that gravity might vary inversely with the square of the distance, he had not provided mathematical proof. Newton had. Still, the dispute turned bitter. Hooke accused Newton of plagiarism. Newton, sensitive to criticism, withdrew from public discourse for years. Later, he would face another, more prolonged conflict with the German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Both men had developed the foundations of calculus independently. Newton had worked out the ideas earlier, in the 1660s, but did not publish them. Leibniz, working in parallel, published first, using a different notation. What followed was a decades-long dispute over priority. Supporters on both sides fanned the flames. Letters were exchanged, accusations made. The Royal Society, under Newton's influence, eventually sided with Newton, tarnishing Leibniz's reputation for years. It was an unfortunate episode in an otherwise noble quest for truth. Despite the feuds, Newton's scientific work continued. In 1704, he published another major work, Optics. In it, Newton explored the nature of light. He described his experiments with prisms, which revealed that white light could be split into a spectrum of colors and then recombined. This proved that color was not added to light by the prism, as many believed, but rather was inherent in the light itself. He also proposed the particle theory of light, arguing that light was composed of small particles or corpuscles. This idea would be debated for centuries, as later scientists like Huygens, Young, and eventually Einstein would uncover the wave and quantum nature of light. Still, Newton's experiments were meticulous. He invented the reflecting telescope to reduce chromatic aberration in lenses. He designed better ways to grind mirrors and construct instruments. His ideas shaped the very tools we still use today. In 1696, Newton accepted an unexpected position, Warden of the Royal Mint. It may seem strange that a theoretical physicist would take a role in coin production, but Newton approached the task with characteristic rigor. He investigated counterfeiting and worked tirelessly to reform England's currency. His sharp intellect and moral conviction made him a formidable figure. He even pursued counterfeiters personally, collecting evidence, interrogating suspects, and testifying in trials. One famous case led to the execution of William Challoner, a notorious forger. By 1699, Newton was made Master of the Mint, a position he held for the rest of his life. In 1703, he became President of the Royal Society. He was knighted by Queen Anne in 1705, becoming Sir Isaac Newton. Despite his fame, Newton lived much of his life in solitude. He never married, and while he had close friendships, including one with the Swiss mathematician Nicolas Fatio de Duilier, his personal relationships were often strained or fleeting. In his later years, Newton became more religiously contemplative. He studied biblical chronology, alchemy, and ancient texts. Some of his writings on these topics remained unpublished during his lifetime, perhaps out of fear they would tarnish his scientific image. And yet, they reveal a man still searching for order, for truth, and for the divine patterns beneath creation. Newton passed away on March 20, 1727, in London. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, among kings and poets, a testament to his monumental influence. Sir Isaac Newton passed from this world in the spring of 1727. He was 84 years old. For much of his life, he had lived alone, deeply engaged with his thoughts, yet by the time he died, he had become one of the most celebrated men in Europe. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, beneath a grand monument that bore the Latin inscription. Here is buried Isaac Newton, knight, who by a strength of mind almost divine, and mathematical principles, explored the course of the planets, the paths of comets, the tides of the sea. Newton's legacy was not only in what he discovered, but in how he thought. Before Newton, the world was fragmented. Astronomy was separate from physics. Terrestrial motion seemed unlike celestial motion. Light, gravity, force, these were mystical, ill-understood forces. But Newton stitched it all together. He gave us a unified cosmos, where the same laws that governed the fall of an apple ruled the motion of the stars. His was a universe of logic, predictability, and order. A machine set in motion by a divine clockmaker, intelligible through mathematics. Even Albert Einstein, who would later expand and revise Newton's laws with his theory of relativity, once wrote, "Newton, forgive me." Einstein stood on Newton's shoulders, just as Newton had stood on the shoulders of giants. And it was Newton who first said those famous words in a letter to Robert Hooke. "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Ironically, that line may have been a subtle insult. Hooke was known for his small stature and hunched back, but history remembers it as a profound act of humility. And perhaps in some way, it was both. Newton was, like all great thinkers, a paradox. He was intensely private, yet his ideas changed the public world. He was methodical and precise, but also fascinated with mysticism, alchemy, and biblical prophecy. He was brilliant and at times vindictive. His genius was unmatched, but his solitude was heavy. He sought not fame but truth, and yet became a legend. Let us now gently walk through some of the fields he transformed. Mathematics and the language of change. Newton's work in mathematics gave us the foundation for calculus, a language for motion, growth, and decay. Though the rivalry with Leibniz clouded this legacy, today we recognize that both men independently advanced this essential discipline. Without calculus, we would have no modern physics, no engineering as we know it, no computer simulations, no rocket trajectories. The very equations that guide spacecraft to Mars trace their roots back to Newton's earliest ideas about motion and fluxions. In essence, Newton helped invent the mathematics of the modern world. Physics and the machinery of the universe. His three laws of motion remain central to classical mechanics. From the design of bridges and roller coasters to the launching of satellites and missiles, these laws govern our built world. His law of universal gravitation was the first step toward our understanding of the universe as a dynamic, interconnected system. Though Einstein's general relativity would later supersede it in accuracy, Newton's framework is still used in nearly every practical application involving motion. He made it possible to predict celestial events, like solar eclipses and comet returns. He showed us that the universe is not chaotic, but governed by patterns, mathematical laws that we can understand. Optics and the nature of light. His experiments with prisms not only revealed the hidden colors within white light but also laid the foundation for the science of optics. The rainbow that stretches across the sky, the bending of light through a lens, the way a camera focuses an image, all these are better understood because of Newton. He gave us tools, both literal and theoretical, to see more clearly. Scientific method and the spirit of inquiry. Newton embodied a new kind of thinking. He did not rely on ancient texts or authority. He experimented. He observed. He measured. He asked, why, and refused to accept answers without evidence. He helped establish a culture of inquiry that continues today. He showed that the universe could be read like a book if only one had the patience, the curiosity, and the right mathematical lens. Mysticism and the unknown. Yet Newton was not only a man of science. He believed that behind the laws of motion and light was the mind of a creator. He studied biblical prophecy, alchemy, and the architecture of Solomon's temple. He searched for codes in scripture. He saw God not as a magician who interrupted the universe, but as an architect who built it with laws that would endure. To modern eyes, this may seem like a contradiction. But perhaps, for Newton, it was not. To him, science and faith were not enemies, they were twin paths toward understanding the great mystery. The human legacy. Newton's influence rippled far beyond the laboratory and observatory. He inspired poets, philosophers, and politicians. His image appeared in paintings and sculptures, his ideas in the halls of universities across continents. The Age of Enlightenment was built in part upon his intellectual scaffolding. His discoveries helped spark revolutions, not just scientific, but cultural. He became a symbol of reason, of the power of the mind to comprehend the cosmos. Even today, his name carries weight. Newton is not just remembered, he is revered. And now, as we bring our journey to a close, let us return to the quiet place where it began. A snowy farmhouse in Lincolnshire. A tiny baby born beneath a pale winter sky. No one knew, on that December morning, that the course of human history had just been altered. That a mind had entered the world, a mind that would see into the workings of the universe, that would illuminate the path from darkness to understanding. Newton did not chase the stars. He sat still and listened to the silence. And in that silence, he heard the language of nature. He wrote it down. And with ink and thought, he gave it to the world. So when you look at the night sky, when you see the moon rise or the tides shift, remember this. The universe was once a mystery, and then a man named Isaac Newton came along and helped us begin to read it. Let's now dive into some fun facts regarding Isaac Newton's life, his legacy, and his influence on the Renaissance. Born prematurely and expected to die. Newton was born so small and weak that no one expected him to survive. He defied the odds, living to the age of 84. Invented calculus in isolation. While in quarantine during the Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666, Newton developed early calculus, the theory of gravity, and foundational work in optics, sometimes called his Year of Wonders. Had a feud with a forger. As Master of the Royal Mint, Newton personally tracked down and prosecuted counterfeiters. One, William Chaloner, was eventually hanged after Newton gathered extensive evidence. Used a needle in his eye for optics research. Newton once inserted a blunt needle, called a bodkin, between his eye and his skull to study how pressure affected vision. His dedication bordered on the extreme. Disliked criticism so much he withdrew. After public criticism from Robert Hooke, Newton withdrew from scientific publishing for years. It took encouragement from astronomer Edmund Halley to return with the Principia. Wrote more about religion and alchemy than physics. Though famous for his scientific work, most of Newton's surviving writings are about theology and alchemy. He believed science and faith were intertwined. Didn't marry or seem interested in romance. Newton never married and is thought to have died a virgin. He once admitted he had never known any intimacy with women. Knighted not for science, but politics. In 1705, Newton was knighted by Queen Anne, not for his discoveries, but likely for political services while Master of the Mint. Had a strange theory about the end of the world. Using biblical calculations, Newton predicted the world could not end before the year 2060. He wasn't apocalyptic, he simply believed history followed divine laws. Suffered a nervous breakdown in the 1690s. Newton experienced a psychological collapse, likely caused by overwork, isolation, and possibly mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments. The Renaissance wasn't just about art. While many associate the Renaissance with Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, it also marked a profound revival of classical learning in science, philosophy, and mathematics. Renaissance means rebirth. The word comes from the French for rebirth and refers to the revival of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge. Newton's work was deeply inspired by this revival of classical ideas. Printing press equals scientific boom. Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in the mid-1400s allowed scientific ideas to spread rapidly. Newton's Principia was printed and reprinted across Europe thanks to this technology. Humanism fueled curiosity. Renaissance humanism emphasized the value of individual thought and empirical observation, principles that guided Newton's own scientific methods. Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo paved the way. Newton built on the ideas of earlier thinkers. Copernicus proposed a heliocentric solar system. Kepler described elliptical planetary orbits. Galileo used telescopes to observe moons orbiting Jupiter. Newton tied it all together with universal gravitation. Alchemy and science coexisted. Many Renaissance thinkers, including Newton, studied alchemy alongside physics. The boundary between science and mysticism wasn't as strict as it is today. Science was dangerous. Galileo was put under house arrest for supporting heliocentrism. Newton published cautiously, fearing religious backlash. The Royal Society was born during this era. Founded in 1660, the Royal Society was England's first scientific institution. Newton would eventually lead it and help shape its direction. Science became public. Renaissance scholars began publishing in open journals and debating publicly, a radical shift from medieval scholastic secrecy. Observation over authority. The Renaissance emphasized observation and experimentation over reliance on classical authorities. Newton exemplified this. He respected ancient texts, but trusted his own eyes and calculations more. Newton's era was the bridge. Newton lived at the tail end of the Renaissance but is often considered the culmination of it. His work essentially launched the Age of Enlightenment, the next great wave of reason and intellectual progress. Newton invented the predictable universe. Before Newton, people saw the world as governed by chance, gods, or mystical forces. Newton's laws introduced a mechanical, lawful cosmos, one that could be predicted and understood with math. Modern physics started with Newton. Every branch of classical mechanics, motion, energy, momentum, gravity, can trace its roots back to Newton's Principia Mathematica. His laws are still taught today in Physics 101 classes around the world. Rockets and satellites depend on Newton. Newton's laws are essential for space travel. The trajectory of a rocket launch, the orbit of a satellite, and interplanetary missions all use F equals ma and gravitational force equations from Newtonian mechanics. The scientific method got a boost. Though Newton didn't invent it, he helped popularize the idea of experimentation, observation, and logical deduction. His work set the tone for empirical science. Apple plus gravity equals global education icon. The story of the falling apple, whether legend or truth, has become one of the most famous origin stories in science. It symbolizes curiosity, questioning, and the beauty of simple observations. Calculus drives the modern world. Newton's invention of calculus underpins engineering, economics, machine learning, signal processing, architecture, medicine, gain physics. Without Newton's ideas, none of these fields would be the same. Newton's work helped separate science from philosophy. Before Newton, science and philosophy were often the same thing. Newton's focus on mathematical laws and empirical testing began the professional separation of the two fields. Einstein built on Newton's shoulders. Albert Einstein revered Newton, calling him the greatest genius who ever lived. Relativity refined Newton's ideas but didn't replace them. Newtonian physics is still used in 99% of engineering applications. Newton's laws power every factory machine. Whether it's a conveyor belt, a robotic arm, or a vehicle on an assembly line, if it moves, it follows Newton's laws. Industry, automation, and manufacturing owe him a debt. Newton's work sparked the Enlightenment. His ideas encouraged people to believe in human reason, predictability, and progress. This helped fuel democracy, secularism, scientific inquiry, Enlightenment ideals that reshaped politics and philosophy. His influence reached literature and art. Writers like Alexander Pope admired Newton deeply. Pope famously wrote, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." He paved the way for artificial intelligence. It might sound like a stretch, but Newton's belief in rules and logic inspired future generations to reduce thought to formal systems. From Newton to logic to computer science, there's a straight line. Newton's laws live in your pocket. Smartphone motion sensors use Newton's principles to detect acceleration and orientation. The very act of turning your phone sideways depends on Newtonian physics. Navigation systems are Newtonian. Planes, ships, and cars use GPS systems that rely on orbital mechanics and Newton's math to stay accurate. Every trip you take is touched by his legacy. His work unified the earth and the heavens. Newton's law of gravitation showed that the apple falling from a tree and the moon orbiting Earth obey the same rules. It was the first time anyone proved the cosmos was connected. Newton once threatened to burn down a house, with the owner inside. He got into a fierce feud with fellow scientist John Flamsteed. At one point, Newton seized Flamsteed's unpublished star charts and planned to publish them without permission. Their relationship collapsed dramatically. He was obsessed with the Bible's dimensions. Newton spent years studying the biblical Temple of Solomon, believing its measurements contained secret divine codes. He tried to mathematically decode the Book of Revelation. He secretly wrote on alchemy. Newton believed in the philosopher's stone and spent decades performing alchemical experiments. He never published these writings, fearing ridicule, but they were discovered long after his death. He used code names for alchemical substances. In his notebooks, he would refer to Mercury as green lion and antimony as Diana's doves, using cryptic language common in alchemical traditions. He saw his scientific work as a side project. Newton once said that to him, his work on gravity and motion was less important than his theological and mystical investigations. He truly believed the universe had a hidden divine architecture. Newton had a pet dog named Diamond, maybe. Legend says that Newton's dog, Diamond, knocked over a candle and destroyed years of his notes. While it's a popular story, there's no solid evidence the dog even existed. He wrote entire books in code. Newton often encoded his theological and alchemical writings using Latin, symbols, or cryptograms, perhaps fearing the church or academic backlash. He's on British currency. Newton's face once appeared on the £1 note in the UK, issued between 1978 and 1988, in recognition of his contribution to the Royal Mint and national science. He appears in science fiction and pop culture. Newton has been portrayed in films, novels, and shows. In Neil Gaiman's The Sandman, he's part of a secret society. In Assassin's Creed, he's depicted protecting Enlightenment secrets. Apple named a product after him. The Apple Newton was a personal digital assistant released in 1993, an early ancestor of the iPhone. It even had a logo of an apple falling. Google once had a Newton Easter egg. Typing Isaac Newton into the search bar once triggered a gravity-themed animation where an apple would fall from the Google logo. There's a Newton crater on the Moon. NASA named a large lunar impact crater after him. It's located near the Moon's southern hemisphere. There's a Newton apple tree that still exists. The supposed original tree that inspired the falling apple story still grows in Woolsthorpe Manor. It's over 400 years old and still produces apples. He's been immortalized in statues worldwide. Statues of Newton stand in Cambridge, London, Oxford, and even India, where British education reforms during colonial times included Newtonian science in the curriculum. Modern thinkers use Newton as a metaphor for insight. Newtonian has become an adjective for clarity, precision, and genius. Phrases like Newtonian worldview describe a belief in a rational, ordered universe. Newton's laws are taught in nearly every high school on Earth. From Tokyo to Texas, students learn Newton's 3 laws of motion. They form the bedrock of introductory physics curricula across the globe. Engineering degrees begin with Newtonian mechanics. Whether studying aerospace, civil, mechanical, or even biomedical engineering, students begin by mastering Newton's principles before moving into relativity or quantum mechanics. Here's the reason physics is a core science. Newton's ability to explain complex phenomena with simple equations turned physics into a structured, measurable discipline, and made it a centerpiece of the scientific curriculum. Every car crash analysis uses Newton. When investigating vehicle collisions, experts use Newton's laws to reconstruct speeds, forces, and trajectories. Accident forensics is Newtonian science in action. Artificial intelligence still respects Newton. While modern AI uses statistics and neural networks, many simulations, like self-driving cars or robotics, still rely on physics engines, built on Newton's formulas, to model how objects move and interact. He influenced the scientific method long-term. Newton emphasized systematic observation, hypothesis testing, and reproducibility, values that remain core pillars of modern science today. The space race used Newton's equations. NASA and the Soviet space program used Newtonian orbital mechanics to put satellites, and humans, into space. Newton's equations helped get Apollo to the Moon. His work is embedded in software simulations. From flight simulators to video games, Newtonian physics powers the realism behind every bouncing ball, racing car, and exploding barrel. Newton's work unified empirical and theoretical science. Before him, experiments and math were often separate worlds. Newton showed that data and theory can and should work together, a model now standard in everything from drug development to climate modeling. He shaped the role of the modern scientist. Newton wasn't just a thinker, he was an experimenter, a writer, a mathematician, and a public servant. He helped define what it means to be a scientist in society. He was a founding father of STEM. Long before the term STEM existed, Newton's interdisciplinary work in science, technology, telescopes, engineering, optics and mechanics, and math modeled the integration we now celebrate in modern education. His ideas are embedded in the International Space Station. Every docking maneuver, mass calculation, and satellite orbit correction aboard the ISS relies on Newtonian physics, even when astronauts float in apparent weightlessness. Newton helped democratize knowledge. By showing that natural laws could be understood by anyone with reason and observation, not just clergy or aristocrats, he helped empower generations of thinkers and learners. His work crossed borders and languages. Newton's Principia was translated into French, German, Italian, and eventually every major scientific language, becoming a shared intellectual currency among Enlightenment thinkers. Global STEM competitions still invoke his legacy. Math Olympiads, science fairs, and robotics tournaments often include events or questions inspired by Newton's laws and methods. Thank you for tuning in for those fun facts. Now, lastly, we will take a look at Isaac Newton's relationships and collaborations with other thinkers of his time. Prepare one more time for a soothing story. Let's jump into it. Let us drift once again into the quiet corridors of time, to the late 1600s, a period of blossoming intellect, deep curiosity, and the slow but steady unraveling of the universe's secrets. In this golden age of thought, minds across Europe were lighting the fires of science. And at the center of this great constellation of thinkers stood Isaac Newton. He was not alone in his pursuits. But he was, by temperament, a solitary figure. A man who could spend years in silent thought before revealing the work that would redefine the very laws of nature. And so, let us explore Newton's relationships, with allies, rivals, and the occasional reluctant companion. Because though he often worked alone, Newton's story is incomplete without the brilliant, conflicted, and sometimes contentious minds who orbited his world. Robert Hooke, the rival in the shadows. Of all Newton's intellectual relationships, none was as combative, or as bitter, as the one he had with Robert Hooke. Hooke was a gifted polymath in his own right. He had formulated early ideas about elasticity, studied fossils, and famously used a microscope to coin the word cell. He was also a leading figure in the Royal Society of London and fiercely protective of his scientific reputation. When Newton began to present his early ideas about optics in the 1670s, Hooke challenged them. He argued that light behaved as a wave, while Newton favored a corpuscular, or particle, theory of light. Their correspondence turned sour. Hooke accused Newton of stealing ideas about gravity, saying, "I have always found that when a man has once got the wrong end of a stick in his head, he never will get it out again." Newton, who was sensitive to criticism, took the remark deeply. From that moment forward, he withdrew from public scientific discourse for nearly a decade. He buried himself in his private studies, refusing to share his insights until years later. When Newton finally published his Principia Mathematica, Hooke's earlier claims that gravity followed an inverse square law resurfaced. Hooke believed Newton had borrowed from him without proper credit. Newton, for his part, insisted that he had derived everything independently. The feud worsened. When Hooke died in 1703, Newton, then newly elected as president of the Royal Society, is rumored to have ensured no portrait of Hooke survived. To this day, no confirmed likeness of Robert Hooke remains. Their relationship was a lesson in pride, brilliance, and the high cost of ego in a field meant to pursue truth. Edmund Halley, the encourager and publisher. But not all Newton's relationships were adversarial. One of the warmest and most constructive friendships he ever had was with the astronomer Edmund Halley, the same Halley whose name now lives on in the famous comet. In the early 1680s, Halley visited Newton in Cambridge to discuss planetary motion. To his astonishment, Newton had already solved the mathematical proof Halley was seeking, showing that an inverse square law of gravity could explain Kepler's elliptical orbits. Halley recognized the importance of Newton's ideas and urged him to publish. Newton hesitated, reluctant to enter public debate again. But Halley persisted. Eventually, Newton composed the Principia, and it was Halley, using his own funds, who published it in 1687. Throughout their collaboration, Halley remained a steadying force. Where Newton was reclusive and intense, Halley was diplomatic, cheerful, and social. It was Halley who mediated between Newton and the scientific community. Without Halley, its possible Principia may never have seen the light of day. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the battle over calculus. Perhaps the most notorious of Newton's intellectual conflicts was with the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Both men independently developed calculus around the same time, Newton in the mid-1660s and Leibniz in the 1670s. But Leibniz published first, in 1684. At first, they exchanged polite letters. But as the mathematical community began to favor Leibniz's elegant notation, tensions rose. Newton's followers accused Leibniz of plagiarism. Leibniz denied it, claiming his discovery was independent. And indeed, modern scholars generally agree both men arrived at calculus separately. Yet Newton, ever defensive of his legacy, launched a quiet campaign against Leibniz. The Royal Society convened a committee to investigate, and under Newton's influence, issued a report largely written by Newton himself, favoring his claim. The feud grew bitter. Leibniz, isolated and discredited in England, died in 1716, largely overshadowed by Newton's towering reputation. It was one of the most damaging rivalries in scientific history, a battle not over truth, but over who discovered it first. Christian Huygens, the continental mind. The Dutch scientist Christian Huygens was another towering figure of the time. Huygens invented the pendulum clock, studied light, and had developed his own theories of wave optics. He and Newton respected each other, though they rarely met. Huygens had read Principia and admired much of Newton's work. But he disagreed with Newton's views on light, believing it to be a wave, not a particle. Despite their differences, their disagreement remained civil. Huygens' insights into wave theory would eventually gain new support in the 19th century, long after both men had passed. Their intellectual dialogue, quiet and distant, was less personal, more philosophical. A slow dance of ideas across Europe's letters and salons. John Locke, the philosopher ally. Newton's influence wasn't confined to science. He had deep ties to philosophy and politics, especially through his friendship with John Locke, the English philosopher whose ideas shaped liberal democracy. Locke and Newton exchanged ideas about science, faith, and governance. They admired each other deeply. Locke even sought Newton's guidance on metaphysics and theology. Newton, in turn, trusted Locke with private manuscripts on biblical chronology. Their friendship was one of mutual respect. A rare space where Newton's guard seemed to lower. When Locke fell ill, Newton offered to visit him and even purchase medicine on his behalf. They represented two branches of Enlightenment thought, empirical science and political reason, working in quiet tandem. The world he ignored. Newton's relationships were shaped not just by whom he included, but by whom he excluded. He rarely collaborated. He distrusted group work. He wrote alone, tested theories in secret, and sometimes withheld results for decades. He did not mentor many students. He did not build a school of thought in the modern sense. In this way, Newton stood apart even from the collaborative energy of the Renaissance. He was a bridge between eras, one foot in the alchemical, the mystical, and the solitary medieval scholar, the other in the mathematical, mechanical, and Enlightenment future. Closing reflections, a mind both singular and surrounded. So what do we make of Newton's place among his peers? He clashed with some, inspired others, resisted many, and yet he relied on them all. Robert Hooke sharpened his edges. Edmund Halley gave him the courage to publish. Leibniz challenged his legacy. Huygens offered an alternate vision. Locke gave him philosophical kinship. Newton stood at the center of it all, fierce, brilliant, and alone, but never untouched by the minds that surrounded him. No genius is truly alone. Even the most solitary scholar stands in dialogue with the thoughts of others, past, present, or imagined. And so Newton, for all his isolation, was part of something larger, the great tapestry of the Renaissance and Enlightenment. A living, breathing dialogue of discovery. Thank you once again for tuning into Background Historian. It has been an honor to provide you with this dialogue tonight. Please have sweet dreams and subscribe for more background history for bedtime.